What up, YouTube? Welcome back to my channel, Skepticus. As always, this is your boy, Adam of NOLA. And today, on another episode of Breakdowns and Beatdowns, we're doing a response to a video from a content creator called Gospel Simplicity. The name of the video that we are responding to is Why Some Christian Nationalists Are Defending Slavery. Or, as I would put this, we are about to see the intersection of slavery, LGBT issues, and Christian nationalism. If those don't seem like they all fit together, check out this video with me. Now, before we dive into it, I want to give a quick disclaimer. On Breakdowns and Beatdowns, there are a lot of these episodes where I am, as my friends across the pond would like to say, kind of taking the piss out of some of these other creators, because usually they have takes that I find to be abhorrent. They have opinions that I find to be egregiously bad. And a lot of times my desire to respond to their videos is driven or fueled off of that distaste for the opinions that they are providing, especially from the quote unquote Christian apologists. This content creator today, Gospel Simplicity, I have not responded to any of his videos before, and this is not meant to be in the same spirit as some of those other responses where I'm kind of trying to take someone down a bit. I actually like this guy's content. I don't watch all of his videos, but he's not really an apologist per se. He's not trying to put out all of the standard badly beaten, lame talking points that we get from so many apologists. He seems much more earnest and honest and reasonable in his approach, and he's not really just trying to talk the Christian apologist line. I don't really consider him to be an apologist at all. But with this video of his, I feel like he has hit a lot of really good points. I'm going to give some feedback on these points, some counterpoints, if you will, but I don't disagree with most of what he said. However, I think that at the end of the video, he fails to really put this together in a coherent way, at least coherent to me, that really speaks to the state of where this country, being the US, is right now with regard to slavery, LGBT issues, and Christian nationalism. So hang with me here. We're going to go through this video and we're going to see what Gospel Simplicity has to say about this issue.
The modern American's moral imagination is profoundly shaped by two things: slavery and the Holocaust. It's been said that Hitler has become the post-war devil, and the idea that slavery is wrong is one of the most foundational moral maxims of our time. And just for the record, in case you're holding your breath, I'll say at the very beginning, slavery is wrong. Feel free to exhale. In any case, during the last century or so, in which Americans disagreed on a host of moral issues, these two have remained fairly constant. Simultaneously, it's an almost equally basic law of attention that if you say things people find outrageous, you will get outrageous levels of attention and engagement. And in an economy wherein attention can be monetized, we find ourselves in a position where people are incentivized to spark outrage. And perhaps...
So I'm going to stop it there with my first comment and just piggyback on what he's saying. It is true that on YouTube, on social media, all over the web, and all over the rest of media to some extent, we are incentivized as never before to just get attention. And with regard to this whole question of Christian nationalism, I do think that there is a danger that can come about from just seeing Christian nationalists as being another set of attention seekers. I mean, they are attention seekers, but to me, they're not in this rather harmless category of like flat earthers who pretty much no one takes seriously. I'm not saying that the majority of Christians in America or anywhere else are aligned with Christian nationalists, but Christian nationalists have the ear of some of the most powerful people in this country. They are aligned more than a lot of Christians would like to admit with a lot of extant Christian goals. And while some of the things they do are absolutely just for the sake of attention grabbing. It would be a mistake just to write them off as such. And I'm not saying that this guy, Gospel Simplicity, is doing that, but I want to chime in with that note before we continue onward.
Perhaps that explains in part why there has been a recent wave of Christian nationalists defending slavery. A few weeks ago, Joshua Hames, a self-proclaimed Christian nationalist, former pastor, and the host of the Reformation Red Pill podcast, made headlines for saying that slavery is not inherently evil and that every Christian should be able to defend it. More recently, Doug Wilson, perhaps the most famous American Christian nationalist and someone with whom Hames is affiliated, went on Sam Harris's podcast and applauded Harris for understanding the Bible better than most evangelicals when Sam said that the Bible defends the practice of slavery.
If you aren't familiar with that Doug Wilson character, I would give you two conflicting pieces of advice. If you don't have much of a stomach for dealing with absolutely evil people, then do not research him. But if you are interested in knowing your enemy, look him up, because he is essentially the manifestation of Margaret Atwood's Gilead. He is an unapologetic Christian nationalist. He advocates for some of the most evil policies. He advocates for pure theocracy. And to be fair, he doesn't even do much to hide it. He's not like one of these people that doesn't want to say the quiet part out loud. No, he says it all the time. And it would be good if you are interested in understanding the darker side to at least see what this guy is spouting. Now, again, that's not to imply that all Christians are following in lockstep behind him, because they are not. But the guy is pretty much pure evil.
While Wilson said that he personally was glad that our country has put the question of slavery behind us and that he thinks the New Testament sowed the seeds for the undermining of slavery, he is committed to the notion that slavery is not inherently evil in all its forms. So, what's going on? Is this just clickbait theology? Is this nothing but a grasping for attention from Christian nationalists under the motto that, hey, all press is good press? Maybe. So
he's going to get into it in some more detail here, but I just want to chime in first and say that as much as I just said that this Doug Wilson character is evil, and any Christian nationalist in my book is pretty damn evil, especially the ones that are espousing things like slavery good. The simple fact is, where this all stems from is the fact that the Bible implicitly condones slavery, not once, not twice, not just in the Old Testament, but over and over and over again. And this causes all sorts of theological knots for well-meaning, upstanding Christians. So this is really the heart of where all of this comes from.
At least in some cases, I think there's more going on here. In fact, I think this sheds light on a deep tension in Christian theology that most Christians have wanted to avoid. The question of Christianity's relationship to slavery is one that's highly contentious. Alex O'Connor went viral, as he's quite apt to do, by getting a Catholic AI apologist tied up in knots when it was forced to acknowledge three things. 1, God as a morally perfect being would not condone inherently immoral actions. 2, slavery is inherently immoral. And 3, God condoned slavery. This, at least on the surface, appears to be a blatant contradiction, and Alex does a good job of pressing in on it in what's a pretty entertaining video, I must admit. It's also not an unfamiliar dilemma for Christians, albeit usually it's humans, not...
I will chime in here and say, he says it's not an unfamiliar dilemma for Christians. I mean, certainly this question of slavery has been getting bandied about in Christian circles for centuries, going back before the abolition of slavery here in the US and around the world. But it's interesting to take the perspective that this is not new territory for Christians, because I would contend that for a lot of Christians, it is fairly new, or at least fairly unexplored. And what I mean by that is this. I have been on record many times on my channel as saying that most Christians and this has been backed up by surveys and other third-party data that I've done in other videos, most Christians have never sat down and read the book from page 1 until page last of Revelation. In fact, even amongst Christians who tell you that they've read the Bible and the whole Bible, usually, or at least many times, they have not. Now, I'm not accusing them all of being blatant liars. If you've grown up in the church, you can actually acquire this false sense over years and decades that you've read the book, when in fact you haven't, because you've been to so many sermons, so many Bible study courses. You've sat in meetings where you are going through this verse, this chapter, or even this entire book of the Bible. Especially when it comes to the Gospels, most Christians that I know have probably read one or all 4 of the Gospels. Fewer of them have read the whole New Testament, and very few of them have read the whole Bible, including all of the Old Testament. So take my mother, for example, just to pick on someone that I know. She's not watching this video, but she's a devout Christian. I guarantee you that she has no idea how many explicit commands from God there are, especially in the Old Testament, absolutely condoning slavery, and how implicitly it's condoned, how brutally it's condoned. I don't think she has any idea of that. So if you were to ask her what the Bible thinks about slavery, I'm sure that she would think that it's not condoned at all by the Bible, or if it's mentioned, it's just like an old story that's not really of God. And I'm sure she would not be lying to you when she says those things. She would just be misinformed. But we'll carry on.
AI apologists in the hot seat. For the past 150 years or so since the abolition movement, Christians have been wrestling with this tension. And to get out of this bind, Christians must disagree with one of the 3 premises. And predominantly, the method has been to quibble with premise 1 or premise 3, but definitely not premise 2, seeing as, well, we all agree that slavery is immoral. Let's start with premise 1. The first half, that God is a morally perfect being, is something that no Orthodox Christian really denies. Whether it's grounded exegetically in the idea that God is love, or philosophically in the requirement that a necessary being be perfect, Christians and classical theists generally want to keep that part of the premise.
I don't disagree with him. And I understand there are basically no Christians that I've ever met who want to acknowledge that God can even be immoral at all. Or it's even worse, they certainly don't want to present God as being an inherently immoral being. That would just undercut so much of the core of what Christians believe and who they are in terms of their theology. But it's still kind of funny to me to hear a guy like this, who I think is a very sincere guy. He's just kind of giving it to you as it is. Like, this is the Christian mindset. He's not giving you an apologist line. But I love that there's no real cognitive dissonance there when you want to talk about God being this deeply, inherently moral being. And yet, when you go through the Bible, it just smacks you in the face. And, you know, you've seen my other videos, you've seen my God-free Bible study. I don't just mean a few times where they describe something bad happening in the distant past. I mean where God is commanding horrible things, where God is directly doing horrible things on his own. Now, I understand that that gets a lot more whitewashed when we get to the New Testament, although I would argue there's plenty of disturbing things in the New Testament as well, but they're a lot more below the surface. There's a much nicer sheen on the New Testament. But if you pay any attention to the Old Testament at all, the idea that God is inherently this perfectly moral being, I just find to be laughable now. But I'm not taking him to task for this. He is explaining the standard Christian mindset here. And I understand that this is a deep part of what Christians need to believe in order to cling to their faith.
There is, however, a question of whether a morally perfect being must not, by virtue of being perfect, condone inherently immoral actions. Here we have what we could call a greater good defense. Basically, the idea is that a morally perfect being could condone an immoral action if and only if that immoral action led to a greater moral good or to restrain a greater harm. So if we apply this to slavery, the basic argument would be that God permitted certain forms of slavery in past times, not as an eternal moral ideal, but as a concession within a brutal ancient world to restrict even worse harms, rather than endorsing the morality of slavery itself.
So I've certainly heard this defense before, this greater good defense. I do, of course, find it to be laughably lacking. First of all, it makes Yahweh seem so weak, so minor, so devoid of anything that we could call omnipotent. And here's why. Because if you're telling me that this was the greater good, slavery was the greater good, I mean, no, I don't know every other possibility in history, but the idea that there was no other way for mankind, specifically the Israelites, to function without doing slavery, and that this was somehow better than the alternative? How? How is that better than the alternative? I mean, I know that Christians will just fall back on this idea that you don't understand the big picture, you don't understand his ways, he works in mysterious ways, but that is such a weakening statement for a God that is supposedly omnipotent. Anytime you want to talk about these concessions like, oh, we had to do slavery because he was meeting them where they were at that time. He was dealing with a brutal people. Okay, but this is the omnipotent, universal, cosmos creating God. And you're telling me that this is the only way, the only greater good that he could come up with. Now, on a more localized scale, I can actually get down. Like when I was a Christian, I understood that sometimes things that feel horrible to us may be the greater good in terms of the big picture, okay? Maybe if you got hit by a car this morning and you were in the hospital for 3 months, that may have seemed horrible. And you might wonder, why, God, why did you let me get hit by a car? But maybe on a localized level, I can understand how maybe there is some greater good to come from that. Maybe a greater good in my life, greater good in the life of the person who hit me with their car. I don't know. You know, there's a lot going on in the universe. There's all sorts of threads going on that I can't see and can't comprehend, so fine. But it's one thing to take a localized event like this one small personal tragedy that happened to me and instead say, no, this entire institution of slavery, this evil institution of people owning other people with all of the requisite poor treatment and sorrow and misery that comes along with that condition. And that was the greater good. And furthermore, that's the only greater good that the omnipotent creator of the universe could come up with. That does not speak well of your God. Now, he's not making any particular case here. He's just laying out these different arguments. So I'm not trying to attack him, but I'm just saying that for anyone following this thread, I think that this is a really weak argument to take on behalf of your God.
Basically, God was meeting people where they were and triaging the situation. If we look at premise 3, we find some Christians simply deny that God condoned slavery at all. There are a few ways of doing this. First, I'll be honest.
Well, the first way to do it is just simply don't read the Bible. Because if you read the Bible, and if you're honest and you're taking the text at face value, you have to work so hard to ignore so much and read so much into the text to come away from it without the clear impression that God absolutely condones slavery.
There are those who, at a popular and perhaps innocent level, just think that there's no way the Bible does such a thing. Often, though, this comes from unfamiliarity with the Old Testament's actual laws. Second, there are those who are familiar with the Old Testament, but think it doesn't represent God's will. In more theologically liberal circles, people might be comfortable saying, look, those laws are just the product of human writers, not God's actual will for humanity.
When I was a Christian, this was very much the way I interpreted these passages, because I always took the viewpoint that these were laws written down by ancient Hebrew men, by old ancient Hebrew men. And I know that there are the claims that some people make that it's divinely inspired, or the claims that they make that the Bible is inerrant. I never took that perspective. I don't think I could have been a Christian for 40 years if I had to hold to some ideal of inerrancy or complete, perfect divine inspiration. If I came from one of those denominations, I think I would have become an atheist in my teens, honestly. But part of the reason that I was an atheist, and a Christian for 40 years is because I grew up in denominations and in a faith and in a family environment where we were allowed to foster different ideas of what this means, whether these things are allegorical, whether these things are mythical, whether these things are the word of God, but it's tainted by human hands and by human initiatives. So when you put it in those lights, then you can kind of say, okay, fine, maybe this isn't all the direct word of God. Although admittedly, it still gets difficult because a lot of the commands from the Old Testament are supposedly God speaking to Moses, like God directly saying, these are my laws. But again, even then, if you assume that this isn't really God's voice, this is men writing down, even in the best case scenario, what they think God told them, it gives you a lot more leeway to interpret the text. But then for those people who feel like they have to cling to inerrancy, that becomes its own trap. He's going to mention this really soon.
For many Christians, though, getting God off the hook for slavery at the cost of biblical inspiration is just not a path they're willing to take. A third approach is to argue that biblical slavery was different from the race-based chattel slavery of the modern era. And look, there is truth to that. Slavery has taken many forms, and there's even different forms within the Bible. But when people today...
Quick note on this, and I won't go into this in deep detail here. I've covered this in other videos, but this is one area where I think he and I might have some disagreements. The slavery of the Bible was not race-based. We have no reason to believe that it was race-based, like black people are enslaved, white people free, etc. It was ethnically based a lot of times because they were enslaving like people from neighboring countries. But there is no evidence whatsoever to believe that chattel slavery was not a major component of biblical slavery. Now, they also describe other forms of slavery like indentured servitude, but the escapist apologist ideal that it was all indentured servitude is not supported at all in the text. It's not supported at all in any kind of historical records. It's nothing but a Christian apologist fantasy.
They call slavery immoral. They typically are referring to any situation in which one human being owns another, and they're saying all of those are immoral. And under that definition, distinctions between ancient Near Eastern and 19th century American contexts, they don't fully remove the tension. The final way of arguing against premise 3 is probably the most common Christian response to arguments about slavery, and that is to appeal to an idea known as progressive revelation. Basically, the idea of progressive revelation is that God reveals himself more fully over time. This allows one to say that in the Old Testament, God might have conditionally allowed slavery, but as time went on, he was always moving his people in a trajectory toward liberation, and thus the ultimate vision of the Bible is for the abolition of slavery.
Of course, he is absolutely correct that one of the most common excuses that you get from the Christian apologist side for slavery is this excuse of progressive revelation. Honestly, I find it to be one of the most lame Christian apologist answers to slavery, and here's why. First of all, just like with the lesser evil idea or meeting people where they were idea, progressive revelation implies that the omnipotent God couldn't fix it then, that he had to somehow bring people along slowly with this. But the deeper issue that I find with this is he even just said that there's this idea that God was moving along conditionally. But there are none of these conditions laid out in the text. There is nothing there that says, okay, this is where we started and this is where we're going to end up. At no point in the entire Old Testament or New does it say, hey, I know I have you guys doing slavery now, but eventually this has to go away. He never puts any conditions on it whatsoever. He never says, hey, you can keep your current slaves, but no more. You don't get any new slaves. He never says, well, you guys can have slaves for 100 years, but by the end of 100 years, you have to figure out how to move on with your economy without slaves. He never gives them anything, any type of specific condition or time frame or anything else that even hints in the text that this is indeed what Christians refer to as a progressive revelation. If you want me to believe that as a skeptic, you actually have to show something in the text that indicates that. The only thing that they can point to is that the messaging in the New Testament is not as explicitly pro-slavery. They don't have commandments in the New Testament that tell you how to treat your slaves, but they also in the New Testament tell you from the mouth of Jesus himself that all of the old commandments, every jot and every tittle still apply. So they don't have to repeat those commands again. But there's never a point where it's clear at any place in the Old or New Testament that this is a process that's moving towards freeing the slaves. Even if it said, look, 2,000 years from now, the slaves are going to be free. I would think that would be a really weak statement from your supposedly omnipotent God, but fine. I could at least understand that, sure, it's progressive revelation, but that never happens. And when you say progressive revelation, I mean, we haven't had any new revelation in 2,000 years. The only new revelation that's come to any Christian since then is what they've imagined in their head. So this idea of progressive revelation, it is truly a fiction created by Christians, crammed into the liner notes of the Bible. It is not in the Bible at all. And I don't just mean that it doesn't specifically say the words progressive revelation. I mean, even trying to extract these ideas of progressive revelation from the text requires a whole host of mental gymnastics because the text, the instructions, the framework simply isn't there. It's just like a Rorschach test. You have to squint your eyes and decide that you want to see it if that's what you want to lean on as your excuse for slavery in the Bible.
And I want to point out, this isn't some like random theologically liberal idea that pops up late in the church's life. You can see traces of this kind of notion of God's progressive revelation and accommodation to culture throughout Christian history. And in fact, a lot of the early church fathers read much or all of the Old Testament allegorically in ways that would seem much more scandalous to a lot of Christians today. And certainly they might even see some of this as more theologically conservative. So this isn't.
He's absolutely correct there. This idea of fundamentalism and biblical literalism is not something that has some rich historical background in the church. In fact, for the majority of the last 2 millennia, as Christianity got underway and then flourished, it is hard to find published church leaders who are telling you that you have to take these things very literally. Now, I'm not saying that there weren't times when they quibbled over exact verbiage in a verse. I'm not telling you that there aren't times when a particular church leader didn't want to take a particular chapter or verse or book in a very literal way. But I'm saying that in general, the historical idea of the Bible up until about 150 years ago in America has always been a more allegorical approach. This idea of fundamentalism and biblical literalism You would think that maybe it's as old as time because that feels very old-fashioned and very conservative. But the strange thing is it's not. It's quite frankly a fairly modern invention from church perspective.
Just like this ad hoc thing. But people who are skeptical of this argument will point out that the New Testament doesn't explicitly reject slavery. And if anything, it seems to assume its continuation by commenting on master-slave relations. However, proponents of the progressive revelation view will say that even this was temporary and that it showed some progress, and the more fundamental message of the gospel is one of equality, freedom, and that those seeds, when fully grown, sprout into the trees of abolitionism.
How would you like to be one of my advisors? I'm using Skepticus's memberships as a way to allow you to have a voice in the content and the direction of this channel. I hope to see you in the membership pool, and I want to hear your voice in what Skepticus is doing going forward. One more note on this. If you want to go down this progressive revelation path, and I don't really care, I'm not a Christian anymore. If you want to believe these things, that's fine. And I do think it's a lot better than taking most of the text literally. But then it does open a whole new can of worms, because most of this so-called progressive revelation is just inferred. As he said, this idea that, well, the New Testament spoke a little better of these things and seemed a little less strict. Well, that could apply to a lot of different concepts. If we want to ride this progressive revelation train, we could then use it to imply that the Bible endorses trade unions. And I'm not saying that the Bible would be for or against trade unions. You guys, liberals and conservatives, can hack that out on your own. But my point is, you could make that argument by looking at the way things move from the Old Testament to the New, but you have to read a lot into it. I mean, you could read into this idea of progressive revelation that the Bible supports universal health care. Now, I know a lot of conservatives want to reach to the screen right now and tell me, no, that's bullshit. And I'm not saying that the Bible supports universal health care. I am saying that if we want to ride this progressive revelation train, it does, and I hate the slippery slope argument, but it really does open the door to then claiming that the Bible supports all sorts of things that aren't really talked about at all in the Bible. I mean, in the Bible, they talk about healing people, and they talk about caring for your neighbor. And that's why I say that if we want to read that a certain way, we can read it as supporting universal health care, regardless of what conservatives want to tell you. Of course, conservatives can tell you, oh no, it sure as hell does not support that. But the point is that this progressive revelation idea is truly just taking the text and saying, let's read into it whatever we want. It's like looking at a stock chart and saying that it goes like this and it goes like this, and then just in your mind deciding that since it seemed to be going upward at the end of the chart, it must go upward in perpetuity. Or because it seemed to be going downward at the bottom of the chart, it must be going downward in perpetuity. But of course, stock charts don't work that way, do they? It may be going up for a while, but then as soon as you assume it's going to keep going up, suddenly it'll go down, and vice versa. And I think the Bible can be very similar.
To strengthen this case, they'll point to the fact that many of the most prominent abolitionists were Christians and received their motivation for the cause of abolition from the message of the gospel. From what I can tell, this was pretty much the stalemate that Christians and skeptics had reached for some time now. While it certainly didn't convince all skeptics, it proved itself to be a firm enough foundation for Christians to carry on. But recently, it seems things are changing, and Christians are going back to the drawing board. Or, I should be clear, some fringe Christians are going back to the drawing board. Why is that? Well, lucky for us, we don't necessarily have to guess. Doug Wilson himself has outlined why it's necessary for Christians to change their approach. For him, it all comes down to homosexuality. And for those who are new to these discussions, that might seem completely out of left field. What do slavery and homosexuality have to do with each other? Well, it all comes down to hermeneutics, which is to say, it's a question of how we ought to interpret the Bible. Wilson, in a video with Jeff Durbin from Apologetics Studios, said that in any debate Christians are having about homosexuality or LGBTQ+ issues, the questions of slavery inevitably rear their head. The argument is that, essentially, the Bible seems equally clear on the idea that homosexuality is wrong and slavery is okay. And yet, Christians have found a way to get around this seemingly clear approval of slavery by appealing to more fundamental principles like the image of God, equality, and liberation. So the question becomes, why can't they do the same with homosexuality? Thus,
bingo. Couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you, gospel simplicity. And that's why I said to start out this video that this is not me attacking this guy, unlike some of my other breakdowns and beatdowns videos. He absolutely is correct that the talking point here that is embraced now by more and more Christian nationalists is that, look, the more you read the Bible, especially the Old Testament, the harder it is to make any argument that it doesn't explicitly condone slavery. It condones it all over the place and in very strong terms. And as soon as you realize that, as soon as anyone realizes that, it undercuts your dogged commitment to this homophobia, to this queer hatred. So some people who have a brain and empathy and aren't disgusting souls, some people would say, wow, maybe we should reevaluate all of this bullshit moralizing that we're pulling out of the book. But if you're a Christian nationalist, that's not where you want to go. Instead, you decide that in order to hold on to your homophobia and your queer hatred, it's so important to you that if you have to embrace the plain truth of slavery in the Bible, then so be it. Now, you'll see in a little bit here, I'm going to tell you this content creator doesn't quite get there. I'm going to tell you why they have to make that commitment, why they have to embrace the slavery of the Bible so that they can also embrace their queer hatred. But let's move on with this video.
for Wilson, this way of interpreting the Bible seems like something of a slippery slope. And so rather than accept that idea, he and others are going back to that initial conundrum and saying that the solution is for Christians to go with the culturally nuclear option. Deny premise 2 from our initial conundrum and just say that slavery isn't inherently evil. In the name of what Wilson calls biblical absolutism, these figures want to not give any ground to ideas that contradict Scripture. And for them,
although the irony of this is they will still pick and choose their scriptures. They will still choose to eat shrimp and bacon and trim their beards, but they have decided they want to have control over what they get to pick and choose out of the Bible. And when they're throwing their queer hatred at everyone, people are rightfully throwing back at them the slavery issue, and they're having problems with it. So rather than fall back on the queer hatred issue, instead they've said, no, we're going to embrace the whole damn thing. That doesn't mean they're going to follow all of the Levitical law. Hell no. They don't want to do any of that. There's all kinds of Levitical law that they don't want to follow, but they want to be the ones in the driver's seat determining which one of the Levitical laws they want to follow and which ones they don't. They want to hold tightly to queer hatred. And as long as they can keep their queer hatred, if they also have to embrace slavery, that's considered to be a non-issue for them.
It means they must defend even the most difficult parts of Scripture. And look, at one level, defending the Bible isn't something that is unique to Christian nationalists. Again, for decades, Christians have been defending the Bible by appealing to progressive revelation. They could have their cake and eat it too, in the sense that they could disavow slavery and defend the Bible. And I still think you can do that. But now that people are taking their method of interpretation based on broad principles and using it to justify other things, like homosexuality, that they're less comfortable with, well, things are beginning to change. And thus, in the name of not losing the debate over LGBTQ issues, some Christians, again, very few, but some, are willing to swallow the very bitter pill of affirming slavery.
I don't want to turn this into an overall attack on Christians, like so much of my content is. But I do understand that a lot of Christians, most Christians, don't want to embrace slavery. I will also say, though, that I think that there's probably a scary number of Christians who wouldn't mind embracing it if they can get the rest of their theological goals met. You can argue that. We can argue over numbers or percentages. I don't have research here to back this up. But I think that if they could get their abortion bans and they could get their gay marriage abolished, and if they could get their prayer in their schools and everything else that they have in their short list of, what they want, if they at the same time had to embrace slavery, I think that there's probably a surprising number of Christians, at least in America, who would check off on it and go, yeah, okay, whatever.
So that's the story of how we've gotten here. And in many ways, it's not a new story. If you want to go deep on the topic of the Bible and slavery, Mark Knoll, one of the greatest kind of church historians in America, has written a fascinating book, The Civil War as Theological Crisis, exploring how debates over how to read the Bible flared during that rather tumultuous period, to put it lightly. Then, as now, some Christians felt that to disavow slavery was to open the door to theological liberalism. Presbyterian minister Henry Van Dyke famously said that abolitionism springs from and is nourished by an utter rejection of Scripture. For him, the Bible was clear. Slavery had divine approval. For abolitionists, the Bible was equally clear. Henry Ward Beecher claimed that if people only read the Bible without hindrance, they'd soon come to see that the message of Scripture is fundamentally opposed to slavery. For the most part, Beecher's view seems to have won the day. And yet, fringes of the Christian nationalist movement today are bringing us right back to the 19th century.
I want to be clear here that Beecher does seem to have won the day as far as Christians as a whole affirming that slavery bad. But he didn't win the day because the Scripture itself backs him up on this. He won the day, or his viewpoint won the day, because society in general finally said, this is embarrassing. It's disgusting, and we don't want to back it up anymore. Now, that took a long time to get there, and it took a civil war, and there were parts of the country that certainly did not hold the same views, and there are parts of the world that did not hold the same views. But ultimately, worldwide, we seem to have embraced this idea that slavery is bad. Now, I do understand that doesn't mean that all forms of slavery have gone away. But the point is, in general, we now hold slavery to be a net evil. But that's not because people looked at the Scriptures and said, oh, you're right. Now I read it all again, and you're right, it doesn't support slavery. No, in fact, any truly honest and as neutral as possible reading of the Scriptures from front to back, I would contend, has to acknowledge that at a minimum, there is a very strong basis for Scripture in the Bible. If you want to tell me that by the last page of Revelation, you think that it somehow justified the abolition of slavery, fine. I'm not going to try to yell you down from that cliff. But if you can't at least acknowledge that the book en masse, Old Testament and New, is strongly supportive of slavery, then you're just reading through your own wishful thinking eyes.
While the debates today are mainly the musings of podcasters with a lot of time on their hands and a propensity for controversy, they signal deep troubles in modern Protestant theology. First, there's the issue of perspicuity. Namely, is the Bible clear on these issues? From our vantage, it has been easy to say, yes, the Bible is clear on this, and we can simply retort that those who disagreed or thought otherwise were just blinded by their times.
And again, this is where I would strongly disagree with him in terms of the clarity of the Bible. If it's clear on anything, it's clear that it seems to endorse slavery. Now, I'm not saying that you can't read into it this message that by the time you read the last page of Revelation, maybe you think it's inching towards the abolition of slavery. But if we really want to talk about what's clear in the Bible, it's definitely not clear that it's against slavery. I mean, come on, bro. That's stretching a bit, but okay, let's continue.
But now, Wilson and others are saying the inverse. If you think slavery is wrong, that's because of your culture, not the clear teaching of the Bible. Second, there's the question of hermeneutics. Is the Bible fundamentally a repository of static truths, or is it a narrative that must be read as one grand story? If so, is that story as yet unfinished? Here's what I mean. Like slavery, could something be allowed to continue during the portions of that story recorded in the text that we call the Bible, but be on a path that continues beyond the final pages? A lot hangs in the balance here. If so, as it seems many Christians want to say, at least with slavery, the real task of theology then becomes discerning the trajectories that are on course from those that are veering off course. Anglican bishop and theologian N.T. Wright has described Christian theology as something like a 4-part play in which the Bible gives us the first 3 parts, and it's our job to faithfully act out that 4th part based on those 3 parts. That's another way of getting at this image of a trajectory that could start in Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3 that we then got to figure out what to do in Act 4. But the inverse.
So just like his discussion about progressive revelation, this 3 acts of a 4-act play analogy, I'm not going to say it's wrong, but it then again opens the door to everyone's interpretation. Now, granted, given some of the disgusting stuff that is laid out in the Bible, I would much rather take the idea that we as responsible, moral, logical, sentient beings need to, at best, take what's in the Bible and extrapolate some better stuff from it. Because if you take it as literal truth, it's disgusting, bro. I mean, there's some really gross stuff in there. So it's probably better that we take this approach. But then again, it leads to much bigger theological, societal, and policy type of questions. As I said earlier, I mean, I would make the case that if you read the Bible as the first 3 acts of a 4-act play, I could make the case for you that then the Bible lays the groundwork for universal health care. And I'm not trying to make this a political discussion about that. I'm just using this as an example where people on both ends of the political spectrum, both of them being Christian, could have massive disagreements here about what it's really implying going forward. But the other problem that I have with the 3 acts out of 4 acts analogy is this. Christians often like to look at the Bible, the Old Testament especially, and they like to make these distinctions between what's descriptive versus what's prescriptive. In other words, it's one thing to tell a story about people in ancient times doing a bad thing, even in the Bible. That doesn't mean it's endorsed by God, right? So if the Bible just told stories about people owning slaves and selling slaves and beating slaves, then you could say, well, that's just an anachronistic story of an ancient time, and we certainly don't want to live like that now. But the Bible has explicit commands from God about this stuff, about how to buy your slaves, about how to sell your daughter into slavery, about how to beat your slaves, about where you can buy your slaves from. I mean, there's just so much explicit instruction that supposedly comes directly from Yahweh himself that it makes it really difficult to then try to reinterpret this as, well, it's the first 3 acts of a 4-act play, and we're supposed to put the last act on the end. When your God has given these very explicit instructions, brutal instructions, it's pretty hard then to tack on your own morality at the end and say, yeah, but I don't agree with that. I mean, I would do that because I would rather tack on my own righteous morality than deal with the bullshit morality of an ancient storm god. But knowing the way most Christians think, I realize that they don't want to do that. They want to look back on the book for their morality. And it becomes really difficult to justify tacking on your own morality in the 4th act of this 4-act play when the first 3 acts have the God figure himself giving very nasty, explicit commands.
would be to say that the Bible is like a law code. And whatever it said in part 1 is equally applicable in part 4, in part 2, and part 3, all the same, rather than one story that's leading in a direction. Look, before we close, though, let me be clear about one thing. Wilson, Hames, and others do not represent mainstream Christianity, mainstream Protestantism, or even just Reformed theology. They're making headlines precisely because what they say is so different from what most Christians believe. I don't bring them up to legitimize their views. I bring them up because, whether you like it or not, they're growing in popularity. What seems like niche internet debates today will be debates in church pews tomorrow, and if Wilson's interview with Harris or his connections with Pete Hegseth are any indication, these debates might not be going away.
So that's the end of the commentary provided by this content creator, Gospel Simplicity. Now, remember, I said that while I appreciate his commentary, I do think that there's one critical point that he stopped short on. And by stop short, I don't mean that he had it in his mind and decided to stop short. I just don't think that he took this next logical step. And for whatever it's worth, because I'm an arrogant atheist, I feel like I need to tell you, at least in my mind, this next critical step that is really alluded to by this whole sad confluence of Christian nationalism, the adoption or embracing of slavery, and the making of pariahs of anyone who's in the queer community. Here's what this comes down to. We're seeing where the Christian nationalists would rather embrace slavery than give up their queer hatred. On one level, it's easy just to say, wow, what hateful assholes they are. And they are hateful assholes. But I don't want you to think of this as just being hateful people doing hateful things. If you only look at it in those lights, you are undercutting your opposition and you are committing a dangerous mistake, because they have far more intention behind what they're doing than this. And they have far more ability to turn this to evil objectives if you let them. Here's my point. There is a reason that they are willing to embrace slavery if it allows them to rhetorically keep queer hatred. And it's not just their hatred. It's the fact that in order to acquire power, to grow power, to extend your power, what you really need, one of the key aspects of this, is to find people that you can other, to find people that you can make enemies of, to rally your congregation against them. Now, you can pick any boogeyman you want. You can rally your congregation against Martians. You can rally your congregation against gnomes. But that kind of hatred only goes so far, because at some point, people need something tangible to point their hatred to. They need someone that they can see and hear and touch that is part of the community that they can point to and say, bad, they're other. I'm not saying that people consciously do this, but sadly, this is how power is accrued far too often in dictatorships and fascist regimes. So, for example, with Hitler, of course, he famously othered the Jews. And that worked because at the time, most German cities had significant Jewish populations. They were minorities, but they were significant. So almost everyone within reach of a German population center had experience with Jews. They'd met Jews, but the Jews were other. They didn't feel like them. So to make them a target of your hatred was natural. And it allowed your people to rally the wagons and point the fingers at these dirty, horrible Jews. Now, going forward, Christian nationalists could choose to ostracize the Jews, and some of them do. But there's a problem with that in America. The problem is that Jews aren't really that widespread in America. Now, if you're in New York City, you've probably seen or know a lot of Jews. There are a few other urban centers like Miami and such where there's a lot of Jews. But in a lot of other places in the United States, there are very few Jews and they're not very visible. In fact, if you're in rural areas, there may be no Jews anywhere around. There's a good chance as an American that you don't even know a Jewish person, that you can't even point to one in your daily life. And that's significant because we can create a pariah of the Jews again. But at a certain point, that loses its power to most people because they can't point to someone else and say, they're other, I don't like them. After 9/11, there was a ton of Muslim hatred going around, and there's still a bunch of Muslim hatred going around, but it's more subdued because except for a few urban centers in America, how many of you really know that many Muslims if you're in the United States? Detroit, for example, has a very large Arab and therefore Muslim population. There aren't many other places in America where you even can meet a lot of overt Muslims. So you can hate the Muslims all you want, but again, just like with the Jews, it's hard to create an ongoing solid enemy for us to fight against when your congregation can't even see them in your midst. But think about the queers. Depending upon the numbers you look at, queers constitute anywhere from like 3 to 13% of the population. There are queers in Montana. There are people in the queer community in Seattle and Omaha and Miami and all parts of Ohio. The point is that if your church is big enough, even if it's the most conservative church in the world, you probably have a few people in the queer community in your church. Now, you may not know it. They may be closeted. But the point is that queers offer, unfortunately, a perfect target. Because again, if you pick a target like the Jews or the Muslims and you try to rally your congregations against those people, that hatred can lose some of its vigor. Because when your congregation goes out in their daily life, they don't see any of those people around to hate. So it becomes more of just this abstract concept and they can't really latch on to that hatred. But when you talk about queers, especially in the last 20 years, now that other previous movements in society have made them more visible in our society. Now, most people, even in rural or suburban neighborhoods, know a gay person or two. They know a trans person. They know someone from the queer community, meaning that almost everyone has someone to hate. This is why Christian nationalists feel vehement about not losing the basis for hating these people, because hating queer people in America is a valuable political tool. It's more valuable than hating Jews because, like I said, in a lot of places in America, you can't find a Jew unless you know where to look. It's more valuable than hating Muslims. I would say it's probably about on par with hating immigrants, but we're trying right now to run all the damn immigrants out of the country. So who knows how long that will be a viable vector of hatred. But as long as we keep having babies, some percentage of those children will always be of some sort of queer persuasion, because that's just the way human sexuality works. Now, I don't know what the exact percentages are, and I've seen different reports on it. Some people I've seen, said 2 or 3%. I've seen as high as like 10% or something. But the fact is, if you have 1,000 kids in your community, some of them are going to be queer. No matter how much you try to browbeat it out of them, some of them are going to be queer. And when they start identifying as such, they serve a perverse purpose for people in the Christian nationalist crowd, because it gives them a tangible target for their hatred. And this is one of the reasons why, even as a straight man, I talk frequently on my channel about queer issues and what I see as this underlying constant persuasion of Christians who want to hate and other queer people. because it's not just about your holy book. It's about finding these other people that you can ostracize for the purposes of your own power and your own social status. That is ultimately what is happening here. And that's why I wanted to add this. I like the video that he did. I agree. I mean, I don't agree with all of his points, of course, but he was just laying things out in a pretty vanilla way, saying how we got here and what the different Christian viewpoints are. And I respect his viewpoints here. But I don't think he took it the last step, which is to say, why is it that Christian nationalists are so desperate to cling to their queer hatred that if they have to, they will absolutely embrace slavery at the same time? That sounds like a horrible deal, but it doesn't if you realize that hating queers isn't just about you having fun yelling slurs with your friends on a Friday night. Hating queer people is about a way to other someone, about a way to set apart your congregation and point to someone else as at the enemy. And that is what is ultimately at the heart of this hatred. And it's going to continue. It's going to get worse. I don't want to sound all fire and brimstone. I don't want to sound dour. I don't want to sound like we're on the verge of the Fourth Reich or anything like that. But I am telling you, this is not harmless. And this is not just the action of a few extreme Christian nationalist people. Every time you are in your church and they want to bring up again why God's word is totally against gay people, but they don't want to touch the issue of slavery, this is exactly what Christian nationalists are clinging to. The Christian nationalists are saying, no, embrace the slavery issue because we have to keep hating the gay people, because that gives us a target. It allows us to use our own hatred to stand apart from everyone else and to rally our troops. I know that's a little deep. It's a little over the top, maybe. But I think that these are not just theoretical issues. Let me know what you think down below. Am I going too nuts? Am I over the top on this? Do you think that there are maybe some connections between what I'm saying and what you're seeing here in the US or otherwise? I want to give special thanks to our members. I am really glad that you all are here. You guys are giving me life. Thank you so much. Please like, please subscribe, please do all the things. If I've said anything here that has upset Yahweh in any way, he is always welcome to chime in. But he never does. I hope to see you on future videos, but until I do, lo, I say unto you, stay skeptical.